What if everything you were taught about the American Revolution, the Boston Tea Party, the Stamp Act, the cries of no taxation without representation, was only the surface layer of a much deeper economic war? What if the true spark that ignited the revolution wasn't about tea, or political slogans, or patriotic speeches, but about something far more fundamental, something every economy needs to survive? Money. But not just money as we know it today. In the mid-1700s, the American colonies faced a crisis unlike anything you've ever imagined. They were rich in land, rich in crops, rich in labor, rich in natural resources, yet utterly poor in the one thing required to make any economy function: a medium of exchange. Gold and silver, the only forms of legal currency, had been drained from the colonies by design. Trade imbalances, imperial policy, and British law ensured that American colonists could work, harvest, build, and produce but never accumulate usable money. Imagine the absurdity: a farmer with a barn full of grain, a craftsman with shelves full of goods, a merchant with ships full of timber, and yet none of them able to conduct something as simple as buying an iron plow. Not because they were broke, but because the British Empire had engineered a monetary desert across the entire continent. What if I told you that the entire revolution began not with liberty, but with liquidity? Not with politics, but with payments? Before we dive in, let me know in the comments what country you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. It is incredible to see how far this community reaches. And if you want more untaught financial history truth that schools never shared, hit subscribe, so you don't miss the next chapter in these hidden stories. Because today, we are stepping into a forgotten battlefield, and the first soldier on that battlefield wasn't a redcoat or a Minuteman. It was a Pennsylvania farmer in 1760 with a barn full of wealth, and not a single coin to his name. In 1760, in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, a prosperous farmer stood at the center of a paradox that defined the entire colonial world. His land was fertile, his harvest plentiful, and his barn newly built, a testament to his labor and prosperity. By every practical measure, he was wealthy. Yet he could not purchase something as basic as a new iron plow. The blacksmith wanted to sell it. The farmer wanted to buy it. But neither man possessed a single gold or silver coin. Neither did the merchant who supplied the iron, nor the ship captain who brought materials across the Atlantic. This wasn't personal mismanagement. It wasn't local misfortune. It was a structural crisis created by British imperial policy. The entire economic model of the British Empire was designed to drain all specie, gold and silver currency out of the colonies and concentrate it in London. By law, the American colonies were forbidden to mint their own coins, and any gold they earned from trade with the Caribbean was almost immediately spent on finished British goods. Those coins flowed straight back to Britain, leaving the colonies perpetually starved of currency. The colonies were rich in everything except money. And here lies the buried truth: without money, a wealthy society becomes functionally paralyzed. Trade collapses, labor slows, goods cannot move, credit dries up, prosperity becomes meaningless because there is no mechanism by which value can be exchanged. But Americans did something revolutionary, not politically, but financially. They created their own solution: colonial script, also known as bills of credit. Rather than relying on the scarce, foreign-controlled supply of gold and silver, colonial assemblies introduced a new form of money backed not by precious metals, but by the productive value of land and labor. This was not speculative paper. It was an early form of sovereign monetary innovation, a system in which value came from the collective trust and productivity of the colony itself. When the Pennsylvania farmer went to his local land bank, he deposited a portion of his land as collateral. In exchange, he received freshly issued paper notes, mortgage-backed currency created by the local government. This script circulated through the economy. The farmer paid the blacksmith paid the merchant paid the ship captain, and the captain paid his taxes, all with the same paper. The system worked. It was elegant. It was stable. And it transformed the colonies into one of the fastest-growing economies in the world. Benjamin Franklin himself praised Pennsylvania's system as the engine of colonial prosperity. But not everyone celebrated it. Across the Atlantic, British creditors viewed colonial script with contempt. When a London merchant shipped 1,000 pounds of wool to Boston, he expected to be paid in British pounds backed by gold, not in colonial paper that might depreciate due to overprinting. To them, the colonies were operating a rogue financial system. To them, this script wasn't innovation, it was a threat, and they wanted it destroyed. From the perspective of British merchants, colonial paper money was a problem that refused to go away for decades. They flooded Parliament with complaints and petitions. They argued that colonial assemblies were abusing their power by printing script that lost value. Over time, effectively cheating creditors in London. They saw the colonies not as partners, but as debtors who needed to be tightly controlled. To them, the only real money was gold and silver, and any system that bypassed that standard was fraudulent. For a long time, however, the British government mostly ignored them. The policy known as salutary neglect allowed the colonies a rough semi-autonomy in their internal affairs. As long as trade flowed and the empire profited, Parliament looked the other way. The American colonies were prosperous, productive, and increasingly self-sufficient, and much of that prosperity was fueled by their independent monetary systems. Colonial script, especially the land-backed paper of Pennsylvania, had turned an economy starved of coins into a thriving marketplace. Then everything changed in 1763. The 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War, ended with a decisive British victory. Britain emerged as the dominant global power. It also emerged catastrophically broke. The war had cost a staggering sum, leaving the empire with a war debt of roughly £130 million, a crushing burden for the British Treasury. The new king, George III, and his prime minister, George Grenville, surveyed the ruins of the imperial balance sheet and looked for solutions. One answer stared them in the face: the American colonies. To the British political class, the colonies were wealthy, undertaxed, and insufficiently controlled. If the empire was to recover its finances, the colonies would have to pay. The days of salutary neglect were over. A new era was beginning. Not of open warfare, not yet, but of economic domination. Now, the London merchant creditors had the full attention of a government that was desperate, angry, and hunting for revenue. Their long-standing grievances against colonial paper money finally found a receptive ear. The idea was simple and ruthless. If colonial script was damaging British creditors, then the power to issue and define money must be stripped from the colonies and brought firmly under imperial control. In 1764, Parliament passed what would become one of the most devastating and most forgotten pieces of legislation in American history, the Currency Act of 1764. On the surface, the act appeared technical, almost bureaucratic. It did not outright forbid the colonies from printing paper money, which is why many still misunderstand its true impact. Instead, it did something far more insidious. It declared that colonial paper could no longer be legal tender for the payment of public and private debts. This legal phrase, legal tender, sounds dry and harmless, but it is the beating heart of what makes money money. When a currency is legal tender, it means that if you offer it in payment for a debt, the creditor is required by law to accept it. Legal tender is the government stamp of authority that proclaims, this is not just paper, this is money. By stripping colonial paper of legal tender status, the Currency Act did not merely tweak the system, it severed its arteries. Pennsylvania's carefully designed land-backed script, which had served as the engine of its prosperity, was suddenly downgraded to a mere private IOU. It could be refused at will. It could no longer be forced into circulation by law. The entire monetary system the colonies had built over decades was thrown into jeopardy with the stroke of a pen in London. Imagine our Pennsylvania farmer again. He still owes his mortgage to the Colonial Land Bank. Local merchants still owe debts to British suppliers. But now, those British creditors and the colonial middlemen who depended on them can legally refuse the script and demand payment in one thing, and one thing only: scarce, tightly controlled, hard to obtain gold or silver. The act operated, in effect, as a retroactive subsidy to British creditors and a death sentence for colonial debtors. It was a silent bomb placed at the foundation of the colonial economy. Most people today have heard of the Stamp Act of 1765. Few have heard of the Currency Act of 1764. Yet it was the Currency Act that first heightened the news. The consequences were not theoretical. They were immediate, brutal, and visible in daily life. As soon as the Currency Act took effect, confidence in colonial script began to crumble. Its power had come from universal acceptance, especially by colonial governments for taxes. Now, with its legal tender status stripped away, that universality vanished. Overnight, the paper that had lubricated the entire economy became uncertain. It was no longer guaranteed. It was no longer sovereign. It was suddenly nothing more than a piece of paper whose value depended entirely on opinion. And in times of crisis, opinion turns to fear. A deflationary spiral began to grip the colonies. Script disappeared from circulation as people hoarded what little hard money they had and refused paper that others might reject. Trade seized up. Farmers could not sell crops. Craftsmen could not buy supplies. Merchants watched their inventories rot on shelves. Ships sat idle as the flow of goods slowed to a crawl. A deep, grinding economic depression settled over the colonies like a fog. This was not an unfortunate side effect of some misguided policy. It was the policy. It was economic warfare by design. The point was not simply to stabilize credit. It was to destroy the colonies. Independent monetary systems and force them back into dependence on British gold and British lenders. In other words, to make sure the colonies' prosperity, their ability to trade and pay debts, would forever rest in the hands of London. Benjamin Franklin, serving in London as an agent for Pennsylvania, was there to witness this conflict unfold. He listened to British creditors describe colonial paper as a fraud. He watched Parliament treat the colonies as unruly debtors, who needed discipline rather than partners in a growing empire. He testified, reasoned, and argued that colonial script was not a scheme to escape debts, but a necessity for economic life in a land starved of coin. Without it, he warned, the colonies would be plunged into poverty. They did not listen. To the British establishment, the suffering of colonial farmers, shipbuilders, and merchants was an abstraction. What mattered was restoring imperial finances and protecting the interest of British creditors. The empty coffers in London were real. The empty purses in Philadelphia and Boston were distant and dismissible. So the Depression deepened. Unemployment rose in port cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. Artisans and dock workers found themselves without work. Shopkeepers watched their customers vanish. The colonial economy, once vibrant and expanding, was now suffocating. And it was into this fragile, desperate environment that Parliament decided to light the next fuse. In 1765, just 1 year after the Currency Act had gutted the colony's monetary system, Parliament passed the Stamp Act. Most school books present the Stamp Act as the beginning of colonial anger attacks on paper, legal documents, and newspapers that stirred cries of no taxation without representation. But what is almost always left out is the context created by the Currency Act. The problem was not just that the Stamp Act imposed a tax. It was that the tax had to be paid in gold or silver precisely, the thing the colonies had been starved of by the previous year's legal assault on their own money. Seen together, the Currency Act and the Stamp Act formed a one-two punch of almost sadistic precision. First, the empire destroys the colonies' ability to create and circulate their own currency. Then it demands that any new tax must be paid in a form of money the colonies cannot possibly obtain in sufficient quantities. It was not just unjust, it was impossible. And impossibility breeds rage. The reaction in the colonies was not a collection of polite essays and legal protests. It was an explosion. The Stamp Act landed in a society already on its knees. To the colonist, it was not simply a law. It was a taunt. It demanded payment in gold and silver from people who had none, not because they were lazy or irresponsible, but because the empire had deliberately removed their ability to conduct ordinary economic life. This is why the anger it unleashed was so raw, so immediate, and so deeply personal. In Boston, a group of artisans, merchants, and restless young men began organizing in response. They called themselves the Sons of Liberty. They were not professors or abstract political philosophers. They were the shipbuilders, blacksmiths, printers, and distillers whose livelihoods had been wrecked by the Depression. For them, this was not a theoretical debate about constitutional theory. It was about survival. When Andrew Oliver was appointed stamp distributor from Massachusetts, he became the physical embodiment of the entire imperial policy. The Sons of Liberty built an effigy of him and hung it from a large elm tree that would become known as the Liberty Tree. That night, they marched the effigy through the streets, then proceeded to demolish the office he had constructed to house his stamped papers. Finally, they descended on his home, smashing windows, destroying furniture, and making their message unmistakably clear. He would not carry out his duties. He resigned in terror. Scenes like this were not isolated. They played out across the colonies with remarkable speed and coordination. Stamp distributors from Rhode Island to South Carolina were harassed, threatened, and forced to resign before they could sell a single stamp. It was one of the most effective campaigns of organized intimidation in American history. It sent an unmistakable message. The colonists would not quietly submit to this new economic regime. But the real power did not lie in smashed offices or hanging effigies. The real power lay in something far more sophisticated: economic warfare. Leaders within the colonial assemblies recognized a crucial fact. Parliament did not respond to moral arguments or heartfelt petitions. It responded to pressure from British merchants whose profits were at stake. Men like Samuel Adams and James Otis, among others, helped to orchestrate a strategy that would weaponize the colony's own economic suffering and turn it back on the empire. They organized continent-wide non-importation agreements. American merchants from New England to the southern colonies pledged not to import British goods: no British wool, no British iron, no British textiles, no British luxuries. Ships would be turned away, contracts suspended, orders canceled. The docks that had powered Britain's export profits would go quiet until Parliament changed course. In London, the effects were immediate and devastating. British merchants The same powerful lobby that had demanded the Currency Act to protect their interests now found their warehouses packed with unsold goods and their colonial accounts frozen. The income they had expected from America evaporated, facing their own financial ruin. They turned their anger not toward the colonists, but back toward Parliament. It was a masterstroke. The colonists had taken the very economic weapon Britain had used against them and reflected it back across the Atlantic. By exploiting Parliament's dependence on merchant support, they transformed their own depression into leverage. Under growing pressure from these merchants, Parliament eventually caved. In 1766, it repealed the Stamp Act. Church bells rang in the colonies. Bonfires burned. It felt like a total victory, a validation of resistance, and proof that the empire could be forced to bend. But as often happens in stories of power, the defeat was not as complete as it appeared. On the same day Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, it quietly passed another piece of legislation, the Declaratory Act. This simple, almost bland law asserted that Parliament had the full authority to make laws in all cases whatsoever for the colonies. No limits, no boundaries, no conditions. It was a time bomb disguised as a technicality. Even more importantly, while the Stamp Act was gone, the Currency Act of 1764 remained fully in force. The foundational economic wound. The destruction of the colonies' independent money had not been healed. The boot was still on the neck. The first round of the economic war was over. The British Empire had stumbled, but it had not retreated. It was regrouping, and its next moves would be even more dangerous. The repeal of the Stamp Act created an illusion of peace, but underneath, the structural crisis remained. The colonies were still trapped in a deflationary environment. Their monetary independence was still strangled by the Currency Act. They had demonstrated the power of economic boycotts, but they had not regained the power to create their own money. Into this tense environment stepped Charles Townshend, the British Chancellor of the Exchequer, a brilliant, arrogant politician who believed he had solved the American problem. If the colonists objected to direct internal taxes like the Stamp Act, he reasoned, then he would impose external taxes, import duties on goods such as glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. Surely, they could not object to ordinary tariffs, a standard feature of imperial trade. The Townshend Acts of 1767 were more than a simple revenue measure. Their preamble made something chillingly clear. The money raised from these duties would be used to pay the salaries of colonial governors and judges. Up until this point, those officials, though appointed by the crown, were financially dependent on the colonial assemblies. If a governor became too authoritarian, the assembly could threaten to withhold his salary. It was an informal but crucial balance of power. The Townshend Act shattered that balance by using customs revenue to pay officials directly from London. The British government sought to make colonial governors and judges completely independent of the people they ruled and fully dependent on the crown. It was a financial coup, a way to seize political control without openly abolishing colonial legislatures. For the colonists, who now understood the mechanics of economic tyranny in a way they had not a decade earlier, the message was unmistakable. This was not regulation. This was subjugation. Once again, they turned to the weapon they had refined during the Stamp Act crisis, non-importation agreements. The boycotts were renewed, but this time they carried a deeper philosophical meaning. It was no longer just about repealing a particular tax. It was about asserting economic self-sufficiency. Women who called themselves the Daughters of Liberty organized spinning circles to produce homespun cloth, rejecting British textiles. Drinking smuggled non-British tea became an act of patriotism. The boycott became a moral test, a public declaration of one's commitment to American liberty. The economic pressure on British merchants was intense, but this time Parliament's response took a darker turn. Rather than simply debate the issue, it decided to enforce its will with armed force. In 1768, British warships entered Boston Harbor. Redcoats marched through the streets of the city, not as distant imperial symbols, but as a living, armed presence. Their purpose was clear: to protect customs officials, to intimidate the population, and to ensure the economic apparatus of the Townshend system continued to operate. The Depression was now back, by bayonets. The presence of troops in Boston was a disaster waiting to happen. The soldiers, poorly paid and unwelcome, looked for off-duty work, competing directly with already struggling local laborers and dock workers. Every redcoat in a Boston street was a reminder of the Currency Act, the Townshend duties, and the economic siege the city lived under. Resentment grew. So did the likelihood of violence. On March 5, 1770, that violence exploded. A confrontation between a soldier and an apprentice escalated into a shouting match, then a crowd, then a riot. Surrounded and panicked, British soldiers fired into the crowd, killing 5 civilians. The event would become known as the Boston Massacre. It was not an isolated tragedy. It was the inevitable result of attempting to enforce a ruinous economic policy. With military occupation, news of the killings, combined with the continuing success of the non-importation movement, finally forced Parliament to yield partially. In 1770, it repealed all of the townshend duties except one, the tax on tea. This decision, meant to save face, would prove to be one of the gravest mistakes in imperial history. The underlying architecture of oppression remained untouched. The Declaratory Act was still law. The Currency Act of 1764 was still strangling colonial money. And the tea tax, left in place as a symbolic assertion of Parliament's authority, would become the spark for the next phase of the conflict. By the early 1770s, the colonies lived in a state of simmering resistance. They had learned how to boycott, how to organize, how to exert pressure. They had forced Parliament to back down more than once. But the deeper economic injury, the loss of their sovereign money, still festered. The Currency Act had never been repealed. Deflation still haunted commerce. The colonies remained dependent on British credit and trapped in a system that treated them as a revenue source rather than a partner. Then came what appeared on the surface to be a minor commercial adjustment, the Tea Act of 1773. To the colonists, this was the entire system laid bare. It was not about a few pennies of tax. The tea would actually be cheaper than smuggled Dutch tea. The issue was principle and power. On the night of December 16, 1773, the conflict reached a point of no return. Members of the Sons of Liberty, disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor carrying East India Company tea. This was not a drunken riot. It was a disciplined, deliberate operation. They carefully destroyed the tea while leaving other property untouched. They were not simply dumping a commodity. They were annihilating the physical symbol of an entire decade-long campaign of economic domination. The Boston Tea Party was not a protest against high taxes. It was a rejection of monopoly, of corporate privilege, and of a distant government that had spent 10 years systematically dismantling colonial economic independence. Parliament's response removed any remaining illusions. The Intolerable Acts of 1774 closed the port of Boston, revoked Massachusetts' charter, quartered soldiers in private homes, and placed the colony under direct military rule. It was not regulation. It was punishment. The other colonies watched with horror and recognition. They saw in Boston's fate a preview of their own future. In September 1774, the First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia, not to quibble over paperwork, but to respond to what they now understood as an act of war. The shots fired at Lexington and Concord in 1775 did not come from nowhere. They were the final sparks in a dry forest that had been prepared for a decade. And if you trace that trail of tinder back through the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act, and the Intolerable Acts, it leads to one law almost never mentioned in school books, the Currency Act of 1764. The act that took away the colonies' money, the act that shattered their prosperity, the act that revealed, more clearly than anything else, that the British government did not see them as citizens, but as resources to be drained. The American Revolution was born from many grievances, political, legal, philosophical, but beneath them all lay a simple, brutal reality, a people who had tasted the power of creating their own money and then watched that power stripped away in the name of empire. When you understand that, the story of the revolution changes. It is no longer just a tale of patriotic outrage over abstract rights. Who realized that economic independence and political independence were the same fight, and who finally decided that if they could not control their own money, they would never truly be free.